Males are often frequently the victims, and sometimes they are not the reporters, and partly because of their embarrassment. They don't want to report abuse, they don't want to seek help. So we have to look at that part as well, how they hold back. If you look at the LGBTQ individuals of all sexes, they may experience violence and abuse in additional ways. Sometimes they have been manipulated by their partners to out them. They're going to tell their family or friends if they don't already know. And so they hold back in any kind of report or complaint about violence. In gay relationships with two men, there tends to be a greater likelihood of that abuse, but that shouldn't be surprising because we're thinking about how males tend to be more physical. It doesn't keep female relationships, gay relationships, from being without violence. It's just, if you look at the stats, it's a little bit greater likelihood for two men. So, and the other thing in the gay relationships, a lot of times they'll tell their partners, you know, that authorities are not going to help a gay person, so you might as well just kind of stifle yourself, don't report. So there's a lot of misinformation that's used to control and manipulate people. So some of the controversies include questioning if a woman can be an abuser. Well, we already know that she can be. They blame the role perhaps of drugs or alcohol on bad behavior. Well, I wouldn't have done that if I wasn't drunk. And while that's not an excuse at all, we know that sometimes then we can see the victim or the partner kind of excusing the behavior. Oh, but he only hits me or she only hits me when she's drunk. Again, not wise. So what is the abuser blaming the victim? How they walked, talked, flirted, dressed, didn't cook dinner, didn't clean, didn't bring home the paycheck. It doesn't matter what it is, of course, but it's a way of blaming. And unfortunately, we have a lot of people in codependent relationships in which that person is all too ready to accept the blame. Dysfunctional relationships and in a dangerous situation. So women tend to use emotional abuse and moderate physical violence more than the partners. And women are more often victims of sexual violence, injury, or coercive control. So in the United States, an estimated 20% of women and 2% of men have been raped during their lifetime. It's an estimated 44% of women and 23% of men experienced other forms of sexual violence during their lifetimes. Female victims reported mainly male perpetrators, whereas male victims are, the sex of the perpetrator varies by the specific form of violence. Male stalking victims also reported a more even mix of genders, males or females that have stalked them. Victimization as a child or an adolescent increases the likelihood that victimization will recur in adulthood. And this speaks to the importance of how a person holds themselves out to others, especially in relationship, even to strangers. There was a study done years ago about eye contact, who was most likely to be a victim of rape, just walking down the street, rape with a stranger. And it was an interesting study, a very simple study, but it was about eye contact. And what they found is that if you're walking down the street and you're kind of holding yourself up well, and someone's coming towards you and you make eye contact with that person, the message that they receive often is, I'm going to take care of myself, I'm okay. And yet the common thing that we often do, some people do anyway, is that if you're, strangers approaching you and the eye contact is started to be made, there's a tendency to look down or look away. That's just a discomfort. But the message can be received as, I am vulnerable and I won't take care of myself. So even in that regard, we have to pay attention to how our patients are presenting themselves, even in a strange situation. I certainly have had a lot of people that have experienced date rape. And it's interesting to me, and certainly never to fault the victim, but if you look at some of the unfortunate decisions they made prior to the rape, I can remember one case that's a simplistic one to report. A woman met a stranger at a bar. She was with a group of women friends, and of course we want people to be safe, so they go out together. And she wanted to leave, the bar, and this really nice guy she'd been talking to for a couple hours say, I'll take you home. So there was an assumption made perhaps on his part what that meant when she said that was okay. And of course he says, can I come in? And she said, sure, you can come in. At that point in time, she had no intention of having a sexual relationship with him. he at that point in time decided that that was what it meant when she said you can come in. And so there was a date rape that night. So again, not to fault victims, but we want to educate men and women alike about the decisions they make. Whether you're drinking or drugging or anything else, you need to be clear-headed enough to understand what kind of decision is going to keep you safe and what kind of decision is likely to not keep you safe. I have, unfortunately, dozens of those stories, and I wish that I didn't, but I do. You probably do as well. So let's look now a little bit at, the prevalence in the United States. We have an estimated 20% of women and 2% of men that have been raped, and then down to the victimization as a child or adolescent increases the likelihood that victimization will recur in adult. So what happens in terms of health issues? We know that because so many health issues are triggered by stress, and we know that this type of victimization is stressful, so that we see the numbers of survivors increasing in terms of health issues, not just in terms of psychological issues, which are also there. But it could be problems such as diabetes, depression, certainly headaches, unwanted pregnancies is another issue. We have a lot of people who force pregnancy. They don't want to use protection, and they force pregnancy on people. Not that they even want the pregnancy, but it's just another controlling issue. So intimate partner violence is preventable, even in quarantine. And I think that while it's harder for people to reach out, I think that there are ways that we can work around some of the logistic limitations that are presented to us today. We know that it affects millions of Americans every year, and those numbers have got to be multiplied during quarantine when we're stuck with people who may be the very perpetrator or become the perpetrator. So IVP is violence towards someone with whom there is a close personal relationship that has an emotional connection. That's what people stay stuck with. They have regular contact, ongoing physical contact, identify perhaps as a couple, and the familiarity and knowledge about each other's lives, which makes the ability to create a worsening situation more likely. In a national survey, 85% of domestic violence shelters indicated that women coming to their facilities were told about even incidents of pet abuse. This is another control issue, which we'll talk about a little bit again, because if you have a pet that you care about and your perpetrator is threatening this pet, you're not going to leave, because we've got, most shelters, by the way, don't take pets. And so it's another way to keep somebody trapped. It can be physical, sexual, emotional, psychological, and includes stalking in many jurisdictions. Again, the legality or illegality of stalking is by your jurisdiction, so you need to check on that. So IVP can occur between heterosexual or same-sex couples and does not require sexual intimacy to be defined as an IPV. IVP can vary in frequency and severity. It becomes chronic or have severe episodes over years. It reminds me of the binge drinker. It's really hard sometimes to diagnose and work with someone who is a functional alcoholic, especially if they're binge drinking, because we know that those binges come and go, and the less frequency creates the dilemma of deniability, which is even greater. So it's the same way with the IPV. Well, she was just having a bad night, or they weren't well that day, they were intoxicated. There's so much more potential for forgiveness or oversight because of that. But while it may be easier to dismiss or minimize, it still is abuse by any other name. So I'm sorry, I should have gone back to that other slide. We'll go back. So domestic violence, child abuse, animal abuse frequently occur simultaneously in a family. There's multiple studies that have found 49% to 71% of battered women reported that their pets have been threatened or abused, harmed, and even killed by their partners. And, we even see that when you look at young children who are being honed for sexual abuse. A lot of times they'll say, if you tell anyone, I'm going to hurt your dog or something like that. There's threats made in those relationships as well. It's just a way, again, of control. So according to a survey of women in domestic violence shelters, there were 11 times more likely to report animal abuse by their partners than was a comparison group where there was no violence. The study of 1,200 women, pet owners seeking refuge, found batterers who abused their pets were also used more forms of violence and demonstrated greater use of controlling behaviors. So women with pets may delay their reach out to help or leaving a dangerous environment because they're fearful of their pets for their pet safety. Across various surveys, we found that between 18 and 48% of battered women delay leaving because of concerns about the pet. And I know that I'm being redundant about it, but to me, it's something that we may not be thinking about sometimes when we're trying to encourage someone to leave that dangerous environment. So we have to understand what ways they need to be helped. It's not sometimes just they as an individual, certainly them and their children and their pets, or for men as well. So mass murderers are another form of violence that is related, and we don't often think about it. But I have to tell you, I think that it's a profoundly important and grossly overlooked issue. And I wanted to bring that up now. Whether we look at the Pulse nightclub event in Orlando, Florida, when we look at the San Bernardino elementary school shooting, I mean, the list goes on and on and on. But we find that the people who are the perpetrators of these mass shootings often had a history of domestic violence that should have raised flags. And so I think that once we begin to look at those numbers, so there was an article written by me and in conjunction with Vieta Krembruski, was incorporated into a book by Sirocco. You'll have the reference. There's a section by Pat de Leon, past president of APA, and basically talked about the whole issue of mass shootings. By the way, the name of the book is The Handbook of Interpersonal Violence and Abuse Across the Lifespan, which will be coming out later this next year. But I wrote about the connection between dating abuse and mass murders, which at the time that I wrote this in 2019, there had been more than 2,000 mass shootings since Sandy Hook in 2012 and 306 mass shootings in 2019 alone. And when you look at that relationship with domestic violence, and it's not a measured, typically reportable connection, it's profound to me. You know, we talk about the use of guns, yeah, but now let's talk about the use of how people need to investigate this to do more preventative work. So we know that in some of these cases of mass murders, we also found that the victims included a current or previous intimate partner or a family member of that partnership. And that comes from Everytown for Gun Safety in 2017 wrote that already, yet we're still, you know, several years later, and we're still not connecting those dots, and they do need to be connected. So the health issues we've already talked about, but according to the Journal of Women's Health, intimate partner violence and its health impact is disproportionately affected populations, including minorities and impoverished groups. So IVP has been associated with a multitude of health problems, including, among women of all backgrounds. Health consequences, I mean, you can guess. It could be particularly anything. I remember when I used to start, when I started my lectures on stress management and the relatedness of health issues. Initially, many, many years ago, I started with a list of the things that could be brought on by stress. This is not just intimate partner stress, but generic stress. And I stopped making my list when I realized that there isn't a physical anomaly or problem that wouldn't be exacerbated by a stressful situation. So I stopped making the list, but here in this particular group that I was reading about, they were talking about specifically fibromyalgia, joint disorders, facial and back pain, cardiovascular problems. I can't go on. Abdominal problems, physical abuse. I'm not trying to make light of it, but there isn't anything, and we know this. The mind and body connection is profound, and we can't minimize the fact that there is going to be a connection. If you are being psychologically, physically, sexually, financially abused, that there is going to be an impact on that. It's an estimated $5.8 billion is spent annually as a result of medical and mental health costs and loss of productivity associated with IBV. And I'm going to tell you again, given the numbers or the percentages of how much that is reported, it's got to be a lot higher than that, but that's what's being reported. So special issues during quarantine. First of all, we know it's worldwide. I mean, I can't get on a plane and escape what's going on in the United States and fly to Italy because they're having a problem in Italy. I can't escape even in a very broad, generic way because it's everywhere. And certainly that has created a lot of the feelings that people have, the entrapment, which again exacerbates the likelihood of abuse in relationships. So the issues are worldwide, and while the numbers vary by country, this is a worldwide issue being exacerbated by the economic instability and fewer available resources. Countries vary about the impact of COVID and therefore the impact of the quarantine, but all countries have been affected. And if you listen to any of the news in the last day or two, well, a couple of things. First of all, numbers are increasing again, the lockdown's getting tighter. I'm speaking to you from El Paso, Texas, and if you've been on the news lately, you know that we're one of the top cities in the country in terms of what's happening. And it saddens me, but every bit of news now is reporting how many mobile morgues have been brought to El Paso because the morgues are overflowing, and certainly breaks my heart. On October 19th of this year, the Washington Post reported that 54% of women surveyed by the organization CARE in Lebanon reported increased violence and harassment during the pandemic. And remember, this is the earlier issues with the pandemic, and we're coming into that next high point. As far back as February of this year, domestic violence reports tripled in Hubei province in China. In France, there was a 30% increase of IPV. In Spain, a 20% increase in calls to helplines, and even worse in Latin America. Violence against women in the 29 to 59 year range was up 94%. These are just some of the examples of what's happening in the world as we continue to isolate with restrictions. And actually, it's interesting because the United States is very rare because we've actually had a decrease in reporting. I know that part of that is because of the pandemic and the quarantine when people are not free to report, but we can assume to some degree that was true in other countries. So why it's this huge difference in our country, I'm not exactly sure. I do understand why it's down, but why it's not down in some of the other countries. So there has been an inconsistent uptick in reported cases because what we see is that as the quarantine tightens, less reporting. When it loosens up, people are reporting probably in greater numbers because they're doing a little bit of a catch up. So we know that right now the numbers reported cases are actually falling by as much as 50%. And we know that it's still a result of victims not being able to report. The other part about that is that because the schools have closed sometimes, or they're only virtual, which means that the children are in the home, that we don't have the school teachers or the counselors who are doing some oversight on this. And they're identifying problems for those children and helping them get some help and intervention, whether it's for themselves personally or for a parent. We've closed that thing off as well. So what really has been concerning for me that the CDC now and other organizations have reported that there is now an increase in murder-suicide. I want you to think about that for a minute. It's typically male-perpetrated murder-suicide during the pandemic. The economic instability as a whole and how it impacts on an individual and a family may lead to increased stress. That's absolute. And it may increase aggressive behaviors. So with the schools and daycare closures, we know that families are already stressed by the competing stressors of COVID, the financial problems, the greater responsibility for your children's education, and all of these things are a perfect storm, basically. One factor in domestic abuse stems from the post-trauma stress disorder, or PTSD. Sometimes we overlook PTSD outside of the military component, but we know that it's alive and well in a lot of different opportunities. It's having PTSD raises the risk of being a victim or a perpetrator. What about the alcohol use during COVID-19? It's ironic when so many businesses close down, there has been a profound increase in liquor sales. And so it's become another risk factor for increasing domestic violence. The sale of alcohol has increased, and there's always been a clear relatedness between alcohol use and aggressive behaviors. World Health Organization does confirm a strong correlation between alcohol and violence between intimate partners. So this one is novel. I was kind of taken aback by this when I read it, but it made so much sense when we talk about intimate partner violence as being a control issue. So now we look at how they can control a victim by withholding necessities. And what they're doing in some situations is basically they're withholding things such as hand sanitizers, disinfectant, masks. And when they do that, what they're saying, it's not safe to go out without a mask. You can't go out without a mask. And by the way, in some jurisdictions, you're not allowed legally to go out without a mask. So what happens then is the victim is further contained in their environment. So that's one of the things that they do. They also use manipulations of the statistics to basically increase fearfulness. It's a scare tactic to keep someone else at home. You can't go out. You can't go out. Hiding a person's insurance card. You can't go get medical help. It could be that they threaten or cancel the insurance. Even threatening to limit the access to medical care should the need arise. If you get COVID, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to allow you to go to the doctors, or I'm not going to get you any help. So scare tactics, control, scare tactics. With travel restrictions, as I talked about earlier, when this is a worldwide issue or certainly a countrywide issue, travel restrictions, the escape avenues are being cut off, which may be used as an additional intimidation to the victim. Abusive partners may feel justified in keeping the victim isolated. At least very much they will use that as a justification for what they're doing. Additionally, older victims who may have significant medical history may be intimidated by the pandemic and fear leaving the abuse. They may also be aware that the shelters that had been previously available are now closed or limited or even dangerous. Dangerous because of the number of people that are there that you don't want to have to be exposed to. So we've got also sometimes in some jurisdictions, the offices that are used to report abuse are closed, filing for protective orders. In some places, they were so overwhelmed with requests for protective orders that they weren't getting back to people in a timely fashion. Another way to stay stuck. So IPV in the USA now, again, domestic violence stats are down, but murder-suicide is up. Outreach varies with the stay-at-home orders. Real numbers are expected only after the pandemic, because I don't think there's any way to know exactly what's happening now when people are restricted in reaching out, or even the organizations aren't available. And remember that child and pet abuse is a subset of IPV. We didn't talk a lot about child abuse, but even children who may not have been in an abusive situation before, they may be secondarily abused by virtue of being witnesses of abuse in their family. So we know that while there is an increase in male perpetrated murder-suicide in which the victim is female, if you look at this happening during the pandemic, the numbers are certainly increased. This is not totally novel, but it's certainly novel in the increase and the degree to which it's increasing and the rapidity of increase. When shelter-in-place orders begin to lift, the volume of contacts made to shelters increase again. We've seen that pattern in other countries as well. It's expected that the report of abuse made only after pandemic will tell us what happened. 951 of those that have made an outreach during the pandemic to the National Domestic Abuse Helpline between the ages of 10 and 24 mentioned COVID and quarantine as a contributing factor. So we already know it's out there. The parallel of IPV during pandemic is the increase in child abuse in those homes. And without schools or daycare, the incidents are not being identified and help is not being offered. It can't be offered in some cases for sure. What about cyber abuse? Well, here's an interesting thing too, because we know that here we are. I'm on my computer and I have my cell phone next to me so that I can look if there's any questions coming in. So what happens? That means that when your kids are on their computer or their laptop or anything that they're on. It's an interesting thing to me. By the way, my patients tell me, my teenage patients tell me that they know exactly how to keep their screen up and how to be doing other things, like even playing video games. They have much more technology talent than I do. But the point being that they could even be cyber abused or abusing or bullying or any terms you want to use at the same time that they're in school. But that screen is open, they're in front of the screen, and this is creating greater culpability during this time regarding cyber abuse. So everyone is online for more hours, for schoolwork, for work or entertainment, and potentially more culpable to cyber abuse. There are many kinds of online harassment out there. They've always been out there. It's just that the ability to use them has increased. So we can start with annoying or rude comments. But what about invasive comments, like issues like doxing, where basically someone has dropped docs or documents, something that you wanted to hide, something that you didn't want to have out there. It's a little bit like when there was sexting and people were sharing pictures that shouldn't have been shared, and so on and so forth. And you've got people that are hackers digging up personal information, exposing the real identities of people that are hoping to remain anonymous, or at least their information to be anonymous. There's traumatic stalking, cyber stalking, which increases the threats of violence as well. We're not going very far, so I guess people aren't tracking you the way they used to track. Some of the conferences I went to years ago talked about how sometimes a partner in a relationship can give you a new hoodie, and there's implanted in the hoodie a tracking device. Of course, we know we have tracking devices on our phone. Sometimes those are good to have for safety purposes, but on the other hand, sometimes we're being tracked by people we don't want to track us. In the references, you'll find an online harassment field manual, and it defines all kinds of harassment potential and what to do about them. Cyber stalking is the prolonged use of online harassment intended to harass, intimidate, place under violence, and maybe even with intent to kill in the extreme, of course. It can be comprised of a number of harassing behaviors committed repeatedly or within regularity that usually cause the target to suffer fear, anxiety, humiliation, and extreme emotional distress. What about even online sexual harassment? We have non-consensual sharing of intimate images, as in the sexting, and it goes beyond the person you've sent it to. I don't know how many people I've talked to in the last couple of years, young people, who continue to sext and just so naively think that it's safe because it's just sent to one person that they care about, who would never, ever, ever share. And of course, I would say at least 90% of the time they're back in the office recognizing that statement of professed confidence is breached, and they do share. And by the way, they're coming in with sexting. It's younger and younger and younger incidents, and it's really bad because then we've got a 13-year-old who no longer wants to go back to their school for embarrassment because it's been sent out to all their friends. So there's non-consensual sharing of intimate partners and even, images and videos. We have exploitation, coercion, and threats used to manipulate someone. Sexualized bullying, unwanted sexualization. If you look at the number of times that I work with people who have had sex when they didn't want to, in ways that they didn't want to, with someone that they didn't want to have sex with, that's another way that people are using some of this information that they get from someone. It's a very naive time, and we try to encourage our young patients to really understand the risks. Sometimes they remain very naive until something like this happens. I had a patient years ago who actually began a innocent relationship with someone who lied about his age. He was much, much, much older than what she thought, and it was actually he was a sexual perpetrator from another state who had fled the state. And she met him and thought he was the nicest guy until she found out he was not the nicest guy. When she became sexually intimate with him, he had videotaped everything and then basically used it to keep her, compliant with whatever his demands were. What saved her actually was that the police from another state had contacted, they thought that he was in El Paso. So they tracked him, found him, and came to arrest him, which saved her. I'm not sure what would have happened if that hadn't happened at that time. She was certainly keeping secrets from her parents about it. She didn't tell me about it, except that she'd met this nice guy. I didn't know any of the backstory until after all of this happened. So cyber abuse is important because unless the victim sets limits, they can be reached wherever they are. In quarantine, while it may not be more likely to be abused through electronics, it's more likely that the support system is unavailable for outreach needed to end it. So with increased usage of all of this technology, basically you're prone to be bullied or to bully if that's your inclination. So when home is not a safe place, that's really what we're talking about. Home cannot be a safe place at any time, but it's particularly not a safe place when you are quarantined there, when you don't have options. It could be even just friends or family members. It could be teachers. It could be all kinds of things that we have generally. We don't have any of that today for some people, some places. So couples therapy often include my recommendation for taking time out when people are getting upset and to step back. At least one person should step back and the other person should never block their exit. Sometimes it escalates to the point where they need to actually leave the home. I think that's understandable to allow for space. So now what's happening for these same couples, and these are not people that are necessarily in an abusive situation, but it could potentially lift to that. So in an abusive relationship, space is often not allowed in the context of control. That's the person who blocks the door when you try to leave or hides your car keys or whatever. So that's one of the first things we do, I do in therapy. But limited privacy right now also ensures that the victim cannot reach out for help right now, whether by internet or phone or a support person or a group or a friend, family member. It's important to encourage people to choose a word that can be used as a safe word. I think that if you have a safe word chosen so that you can let someone know you're in trouble, you can use that word even when there's someone standing right next to you or monitoring your calls or your texts. And so hopefully that person understands that safe word. So it's a word, I don't know how I want to call it a safe word, but it's a word that basically can bring safety to you. And I actually heard of a case. This was I was in New York on one of the morning shows on this issue of violent relationships, and they talked about a girl who she was 16 years old, living in her home with a 21-year-old. This was not a patient. So I can tell you a little bit about these details. It was public in the media. She was trying to break up with this 21-year-old who was living with her with the agreement of her mother. And basically, he came and kidnapped her at knife point because she chose to break the relationship. He took her to Mexico, and luckily, she and her mother did have a safe word. And he allowed her to call the mother and say that she was safe. And she used the word, and they were able to track the call. So there were two pieces there. They knew, she's saying, "I'm fine. I want to be with him." She used her word, and the police were able to find him, and they were able to save her, bring her to safety. I don't know that he was going to harm her except to keep her, kidnap her, but nonetheless, it worked. So I think having a word that you can work into a conversation is something I want to encourage my patients to have, and especially today when you again may have a perpetrator standing over your shoulder. So limited options mean that the abuser is able to limit emotional or physical escape. Even the ability to get a protective order is hampered when some of the city's offices that rendered that type of protection have closed, and the shelters are full or they're unsafe. There's fewer and fewer options. So educating to prevent. One of the things that we really believe is that we want to start early in educating. We want to repeat. Like anything that we want people to learn, it's important that you give that message over and over and over again, over years in the case of starting with very young kids in school, maybe even preschool, and then really certainly through middle school and high school and college. We want to include the parents so that parents are aware. The organization Jennifer Ann's group is named after Jennifer Crecente, who was murdered by an ex-boyfriend in 2006. And I certainly know that as a clinician, I was unaware of the high incidence of this kind of abuse and the potential for great harm. Absolutely had no idea. So in El Paso, Texas, we have El Paso Independent School District. It's the largest school district in El Paso. It's one of the largest in the state. And we've been working with that district for more than 10 years. And the then superintendent basically believed to educate the students needed to begin early, at least by grades 5 to 6, in middle school, and needed to continue through high school with appropriate messages for the age group, of course, but just to continue to educate every year in a different way, a different message that parallels the important messages of staying safe in relationships, not being a victim, and certainly not being a perpetrator. So at this point in time, I'm going to turn this over to Drew Crecente, who is going to pick it up from here on educating to prevent. So this is so much fun for me to learn all of this today. Let's see if this works.
Okay, so it looks like that worked, I believe. Hi, I'm Drew Crecente. I'm the founder and executive director of Jennifer Ann's group. Our focus is on the prevention of teen dating violence. And I think I'm going to get through this part in about, it's going to be about 30 minutes, and then we'll take a break. So any of you who are wondering when your break is coming, about 30 minutes. Let's see how quickly I can go through this while still have it be meaningful. So for teen dating violence prevention, when I first started the organization, there were several things I realized. The first one was that there was very little awareness about what teen dating violence was. I would say the phrase to people, and they would have to parse through the words and say teen dating violence, and they inevitably would say, "Oh, is that a thing?" Because they didn't realize that this was not even on their radar. In fact, 81% of parents are not aware that teen dating violence is a problem, or do not think that it is a problem. So for Jennifer Ann's group, our first focus was on just increasing awareness. Beyond that, what we want to do is we want to educate people. We want to give them the warning signs of a potentially abusive relationship. We want to tell them where they can turn if they need assistance. And then the final thing that we've learned to focus on is persuasion, because we can increase awareness amongst some people, and that will help prevent it. We can educate others, and that will help prevent it. But then some people have very unhealthy beliefs or attitudes regarding relationship norms and gender norms. And so for those people, we actually have to persuade them. And all of these people, our goal, since we are working on prevention, is to start when they're as young as possible. Obviously, some of the topics that we're discussing aren't appropriate for all ages. As Dr. Richeson was saying, we certainly believe that by middle school, this is some of the information that we would hope would be taught in schools, or that the parents are engaging their children around. So initially with Jennifer Ann's group, we had a website, which was primarily about education and awareness. Then we created these little plastic cards, 10 warning signs of an abusive relationship, toll-free number from the National Dating Abuse Helpline that they could call for assistance. Then we came up with these bookmarks, again, some of the same information, basically trying to find a way to directly engage young people. Because if 81% of parents aren't aware of this, if schools either lack the mandate or lack the funding or lack any other resources like subject matter experts, we're wanting to find a way to reach young people directly so that they're empowered to learn about this in order to help prevent it. But these very static resources, although I think this is a good approach, it's very limited. And one of the limitations is cost. Another limitation is how we distribute these. So over the years, we have distributed well over 500,000 of these educational cards and these educational bookmarks throughout the United States to different organizations, including school districts. But again, they were very costly. And frankly, one of our highest bills every month was to UPS, just shipping these 5,000 cards at a time to different districts. So in looking for a new solution, we really wanted something that was going to easily scale up, would easily be accessible by everybody, even if their parents weren't talking about this, even if their school district wasn't covering this. Young people could find this information on their own if they wanted, and maybe this is information they would actually seek out. So let me show you a real quick video, less than 2 minutes. Now I'm going to have to do the share screen to make sure it works. That is just a very high level overview of the program that I spend probably 90% of my time on now, which is called Gaming Against Violence. And let me find that screen. And here we go. Okay. Just about 2 minutes. Okay, so I know that was a lot of information, but the good news is that I've got, at the end of the presentation, we are going to have a document. We're going to give you the link to a document that's going to contain links to a white paper that really discusses an overview of the dangers of teen dating violence. It's going to talk about the existing approaches to it, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the issues with the current approaches and why we find games to be more compelling. But some of those reasons are, for example, cost. For school districts that lack the funds, this is free. Also, we know that young people greatly prefer this approach to a lecture or a video or text that they're reading. So again, there's going to be a link to that white paper at the end of this presentation. There's also going to be links to every single video game that I discuss, as well as links to and citations to all the other information. In terms of the applicability during COVID, during the pandemic, from the beginning, it was very important to us that these games be as ubiquitous as possible. Since we knew that we did not want to have to necessarily rely on the parents, did not want to have to rely on the school districts, we wanted students to be able to find these games on their own if need be. So because of that, most of our games are available just to play in a web browser. And the technology that's used, these are games where you don't have to download anything to a computer. So even if you're in a public library, for example, you should be able to play these games in a web browser because it doesn't require installing any plugins or anything else that might be a security risk. Additionally, we have games available through iOS, for iOS devices through Apple's App Store, as well as Amazon's App Store, Google Play. We even have one game available for the Echo device from Amazon, whose name I won't say, or it will start responding to me. It's in the background. But again, our goal is to reach as many people as possible, even if the parents aren't addressing this, or if the schools aren't addressing this. And one example of how this is effective is that about a year and a half ago, I guess, I was contacted by email out of the blue from World Vision, huge organization, much huger than this organization, and they wanted to know if one of our games about consent, if we could modify it for them, and their focus was on young people living in Vanuatu. Okay, I had to look up Vanuatu, but this is a nation where not everybody necessarily has a computer at home, where the school systems don't necessarily have all of the funding they need. And it also has one of the highest rates of sexual assault against young women and girls under the age of 15 in the nation, in the world. And so they were reaching out to us because they saw how we could reach everybody. Because although they might not have computers at home, almost all of the students have one of these. They've got a smartphone. And we made sure that we found out what model is most popular in Vanuatu. And so we made a game that would work under those specs, put it into Google Play, made sure it was free. And young people in Vanuatu on different islands, I mean, I have pictures of them learning about consent and what healthy relationships look like through a video game. I love that because I really love how really forward thinking they were, how very open they were to innovation. And rather than seeing video games as a necessary evil that maybe cause violence, instead recognizing video games as just another resource. It's a tool. It's like a hammer, and you can use this hammer to build a house, or you can use it to destroy a house. And in our case, we're using it to build houses. We're using the good in video games. And you know, I think people, if someone said, you know, I saw this movie that really changed my life, or I read this book that changed my life, we wouldn't bat an eye. But it's difficult sometimes when you say, I played this video game that changed my life, because there is a perception about what video games are and what they aren't. I don't think it's an accurate perception, because again, anything you could do with movies, with books, through song, you can do the same things in video games, except you can do more, in part because video games are interactive. And so it's not passive. You're not just letting this information come to you, but you're participating in this. And again, there's a lot more about that in the white paper that I would encourage you to read. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to briefly go through 3 games related to teen dating violence in some way. We're going to take a break. Dr. Richeson will come back, and then afterwards I'll come back and I'll talk specifically about consent games, because we have several games that are just about consent. So let's see. First, let me see if I can maneuver this and get to where I need to be. So one of the games, this game is from 2010. It was created by a small development company in Bangkok, in Thailand. And this game has really resonated with a lot of people. I think it's wonderful. I think, you know, up until I saw this game, the impact that this game was having on people, I really was very focused on just increasing awareness, just providing educational information. But when I started reading some of the reviews that very young people were writing about this game, I realized it was really touching people. It was genuinely affecting them. It was impacting them. Some of the things that people said, they're like, this game does immerse you into its world if you allow it. Please allow it. Wow, that was wow. Any game that makes my thoughts switch over to capital letters most of the time is truly amazing. Everybody should see this immediately. Please watch this and understand what it is saying. I said, okay, so I get this now. A little better is that the narrative here, they're identifying with the primary character, the protagonist in this game, and it matters to them. Another thing that's nice about this game is, in this case, the protagonist is not the one in the abusive relationship. Uh, there's several reasons that that works well. And one of the reasons is sometimes when I talk about teen dating violence, and a parent will say, oh, well, my child is 16 and they know they're not allowed to date until they're 18, or whatever they say. I know it's pointless for me to argue with them. I know it's pointless for me to make them become aware that their child is probably misleading them, because that's not going to help anybody. So instead, what I say is, yeah, but does your child have friends who might be in abusive relationships? And then their mind is much more open to that. So here we have the story of Grace, and she's very worried about her friend Natalie, who started dating somebody. And once she started dating him, things really changed. Natalie stopped hanging out with Grace as often. Her grades started slipping, and just a variety of things. And so I'm going to go just through little bits and pieces of it. And let me adjust the volume here to get this so it's not too loud. Okay, so this is it's got very gentle graphics, and it also has very I think gentle music, which is nice. So I'll start with the prologue just so that you'll have a better understanding of the backstory than I was able to give you. So this is Grace here on the left side. Oh, I did skip the prologue. I didn't mean to. But basically, she said, I really think Natalie's in an abusive relationship, but I know Natalie. If I call Natalie and I just say, Natalie, the guy's bad for you, you shouldn't be with him, she's going to say, you know what, Grace, I don't think you're a very good friend. And that will be it. So instead, what Natalie does, instead what Grace does, she identifies incidents in the past that have been really unhealthy with Natalie and her boyfriend. And she makes a note in her memo pad every time she recalls one of these instances. And once she has enough notes in her memo pad, then she's ready for the phone call. And then in the game, you actually can have the phone call with Natalie, between Grace and Natalie. And depending on how many different things you've identified as unhealthy, you have various branches to the dialogue that becomes available to you. There's 3 possible outcomes to the game, and in only one of those outcomes does Natalie leave the abuser, which is frustrating, but is also probably a little more realistic. And so here we have Grace, and we look at different things in her room. Natalie got me those shoes for my last birthday. Told her not to get me anything though, but she won't listen. They're now my favorite, apparently. Here's it's a picture of Natalie and me. I think this was taken before Natalie and Ken started going out. Seems like she's changed a lot since then. We could go over to the other part of her room. Let's see if I can find anything useful in this mess. No, not this. Whoa, why is this thing here? Oh my, I really need to throw this trash away. And again, this is a serious issue, but that doesn't mean that every aspect of these games has to be serious. And they really aren't, because we're wanting to engage people who, although we know that we want the games to be compelling, it's okay if they're also a little entertaining. And humor is, of course, one of the ways to do that. Lots of books that I haven't read, some pieces of paper as well. I should find time to read them. Right now, I should focus on Natalie. This can wait. And it's been a while since I've played this. Okay, so this is a flashback. So, right, that reminds me, we had a party over at the Hamiltons last month. Natalie and I went to that party, and so did Ken. And so now we flash back so that we could see what happened at the party. Woo, that was one great party, wasn't it? Natalie doesn't have a lot to say. Jake Hamilton sure knows how to throw a party, don't you agree? Earth to Natalie, are you listening to me, like, at all? Sorry, Grace, you were saying? Let me guess, you're looking for Ken, aren't you? And I thought we're leaving. You want to say goodbye to him or something? Oh, wait, you want him to take you home? Well, no, I mean, yes, kind of. All right, I think I saw him inside with his friends. I'm going to go get him for you. Then I could grab a drink or something. Okay, thanks, Grace. So now Grace heads over to look for the boyfriend. There he is. Seriously, guys, I can't believe how stupid she is. I mean, you pretty much have to be brainless to do something like that. Hmm? It seems like he's talking about someone behind their back. Of course, we know who he's talking about. I have a bad feeling about this. Dude, if your girl knew about this, you'd be in real trouble, man. Oh, give me a break. Natalie, she doesn't care. She's all over me, man. And she knows I'm just kidding. We do this all the time. And what's with all the time? I doubt Natalie take this as a joke. Ken, Natalie's waiting for you at the front. See, what did I tell you? All right, Grace, I'm coming with you. 2 minutes later. Ken, I think we need to talk. About what? About what you just did to Natalie. I know I'm not Natalie, but I'm pretty sure she does not appreciate that. How could you do that? Calling her stupid and brainless in front of everyone? Oh, come on, have a sense of humor. It was just a joke, nothing serious. I have a hard time believing that Natalie'd find that very funny. Look, just stay out of this, all right? What? Oh, there you are. What took so long? And so, well, Ken, I think Natalie and I should leave. It's 11 p.m. tonight. Well, I think we're going to. So, after we get through this flashback, which winds up with Natalie staying out much too late, not studying for the quiz, and then doing very, very badly on the quiz the next day, Grace goes ahead and she makes a note of this. So better write a note. So Ken humiliates Natalie and gets her to do things she doesn't want to do. So again, this is just one thing that she notes. And once you have about 6 of these things, then you have the option to make the phone call. And again, there's 3 different possible endings. But this game really resonated with people. And when they were getting one of the 2 unhealthy endings to the game, people were very upset and they were writing this in their reviews. How could you have her stay with him? And I would point out to them there were different options, but again, people cared. And these are not fun topics, but here we have young people really caring and hopefully not only seeing a way to identify potentially abuse in their own relationships, but become better informed as a bystander so that they know how to respond in a different way should a friend of theirs be in a similar situation. Here's a game called Honeymoon, and this is a healthy relationship game. And we partnered with the El Paso Independent School District to use lesson plans that we had an educator create. And about a half dozen of the schools in El Paso actually went through the lesson plans with this game. And the response was, it was phenomenal. Everybody liked it, which was great, but also bad because it was a pilot test. And I was hoping to get feedback that would help me improve either the lesson plans or the game. But again, everything's it's colorful, it's cheerful. One important thing about this, and we try to do this as much as possible, we allow people to select their gender. We allow them to select the gender of their dating partner or their crush, whatever that is, including same-sex relationships. So to the extent possible, we try to continue to get that message out there that this can happen to anybody. We really don't like people thinking that it's only certain people that abuse happens to, because we know that the reality is that that's not true. And I'll just go through this, just a little bit of this. But there's 5 episodes of this, and it basically shows somebody having that very first crush and having those butterflies in their stomach and having all of these really exciting things happen to them. And as the story proceeds, you've got these options. So you can stay in bed a while longer or get ready for school. we'll go ahead and get ready so that we can have uh, this character go downstairs. Because another thing that is really important about this game that we really liked is that it has a very healthy family. It has really great role models in the game, and a lot of the lesson plans do talk about the value of family and the value of strong role models and what happens if you don't have these in your family. So we're trying to be as inclusive as possible, but still present to people, we recognize that people who've witnessed healthy relationship modeling, they kind of have a leg up, because if you've not witnessed it amongst your family, like your parents or older siblings, if you're not learning this in the schools, you're turning to your peers who know as little as you, or you're turning to your culture. And we know that TV, movies, books, songs, video games, our culture, unfortunately, very often represents very, very unhealthy attitudes towards dating and relationships. Things like stalking become, it becomes comedy in a lot of TV shows and movies. So you go through this game basically, and you go through the honeymoon period of that relationship until the relationship becomes more problematic. It never becomes very abusive, but you do recognize that it's becoming unhealthy. And there's, I think, 4 different options, different outcomes to this game. And I mean, the worst does involve a little bit of abuse, but for the most part, it's very kind of controlling, jealous behavior. The parents have conversations with you about jealousy isn't sexy, jealousy isn't fun. You're in a classroom where they talk about Romeo and Juliet, and they say, "Wait a second, how is this a romance? You've got these 2 people who've died from suicide. You've got people being killed. There's nothing that's romantic about this. These are terrible messages that we're learning." So that's Honeymoon, and the link not only for the game, but the link to the 30+ pages of lesson plans are also in the document at the end of the presentation. And then I'm just going to go touch on one more of these games because I keep getting text messages saying I need to go faster. So Lamplight Hollow. This is a game less than a year ago, we published this. When we released this game, we really didn't talk much about what the theme of the game is. Instead, we made it mostly just an entertainment-based game. You can see, where do your dreams take you? Which is a little intriguing, but it doesn't say play this game to learn about how to prevent relationship abuse, because we wanted to maybe have them learn the message on their own. And so I'll just share this, the beginning part of the game with you. Do a little narration since we don't have a narrator in this game. And let me get this set. Okay, so Lamplight Hollow. You're dreaming again. A lucid dream involving an enormous mouse working in an office. It doesn't end well. Dreams are weird. You feel yourself turn over in bed, the rumble of the morning traffic, but still you don't wake up. Stories like this one usually start with a kidnapped princess or some kind of evil wizard. This one starts with a snooze button. But mostly it starts with you falling. So Lamplight Hollow, a game created by a small group in the UK, has a lot of the really wonderful dry humor that a lot of people in the UK have. And it's a clever little role-playing game with some very quirky things. The entire game takes place in a person's dream. And so here, you dust yourself off. Miraculously, there isn't a scratch on you. You survey your surroundings, a dank jail cell. You approach the bars. Perhaps they're unlocked. No such luck. You locate the problem, a large stick jammed in the mechanism. A voice, ow, hey, what gives? Stick, would you knock that off? I'm right here. What, never seen a fairy stuck in a gate before? And the game goes on from there. So again, this is very lighthearted game, and it allows you to explore this this person's game to understand, I mean, this person's dream, to understand what it is that they're dreaming about and why they're dreaming about it. And it's not until you get about halfway through the game that you start to realize that this is a person who has been gaslit in their relationship. And this game came out of our theme for last year, I guess, was gaslighting, because it was being talked a lot in the media a lot, but they were kind of, it seemed like very often they were presenting gaslighting as just lying, as being you know, it's lying. It's like, well, you know, actually what it is getting somebody else to question their own sense of reality and instead adopt your reality if you're the abuser, and in place of their own reality. And of course, that's very dangerous, because if you want to really exert power and control over somebody, one way to do it is to convince them that everything they think is correct isn't. It's very isolating, it's very powerful, and I do think it's great for us to have a national conversation about gaslighting, but I don't think it's very helpful when that conversation is inaccurate. And okay, so that was it for, that was all I was going to cover on these teen dating violence related games. And when I come back after Dr. Richeson speaks, I will be talking about our consent games, and we have 5 or 6 of those. But I think right now what we're going to do is we're going to be taking a break. I'm not sure how long we're supposed to take, but it's been suggested, keep your Zoom window open when you take your break so that you remain connected and we don't have to re-add everybody. And how long is the break?
Well, I think we're still give them 10 minutes. Keep in mind that 10 minutes, you can be walking away from your computer anytime during this, and we would never know. But I think that 10 minutes would be a reasonable amount. So we'll see you back here in 10 minutes. I do have one question to answer. I'll do that as soon as we get back. 10 minutes.
All right, see y'all in 10 minutes.
Okay, I think it's been 10 minutes. So we may go ahead and start again. Mute all except me. Trying to. There we go. Okay. All right. So I don't see me anymore, but hopefully you can still see me if you want to. You don't need to see me. You just need to see the slides. So I did want to answer the one question that I saw come in while right before break, and they were asking for an example of a safe word. I think that's a great question. So the two things that cross my mind, because it's really something that you identify between two people or one person and, you know, a group of people, family members, friends, whatever. So they're going to have to identify that themselves. But it should be a word that you don't use commonly in everyday conversation, because you don't want to stumble onto using your word. The other thing, it should be something that doesn't bring a lot of attention. If you're sitting there and there's a perpetrator hanging over your shoulder, that if you said something that would kind of get their attention. So two things that crossed my mind, you know, very different kind of examples. You're talking to someone and they're saying, well, you know, how are you? And you say, you know what, I'm fine, but you know, my left knee started hurting again. So it could be left knee. It could be anything like that that would be fitting into a conversation if someone says, how are you? So you may want to do that. The other thing, the other example that I came up with after that question came in is that you could use the word peanut butter. You know, I'm fine, but I've really been craving peanut butter lately. I mean, maybe that's a little more obvious, I don't know. But it gives you an opportunity to stop and think about what would work. And of course, as we're working with our patients, to give them some ideas of how to work a word that you don't use every day into a conversation that would allow them to notify someone very cautiously that they need help of some sort. They can also come up with a plan at the same time. So instead of just saying, my left knee hurts, it would be, if I say my left knee hurts, please send someone to the house, that kind of thing. So I hope that answers your question. So moving along, okay, or not. There we go, good. I'm still having so much fun learning this. Just as I learn it, we'll be done. But anyway. So as we look at the next thing, we're talking about the facts on tweens, teens, and dating violence. And the reason this is important to me, because I think the more we're aware of how early this starts, the more we can invest in having early intervention. And by the way, speaking of early intervention, I just want to do a shout out to TPF, the foundation end of TPA. They have a grant under Jennifer Ann's name. It's the Jennifer Ann Memorial Grant, which is money given, and there's going to be an award given this year for a graduate student in the state of Texas who has a theme in their dissertation or their thesis that ties into the prevention of dating abuse. And we're very grateful to TPA for starting that. It's been in place since the murder of Jennifer Ann in 2006. Okay, so the facts on tweens and teens. Remember, as I told you already, that the facts are so variable, so don't be too put off by the fact that you'll read one thing and say, wait a minute, it says 1 in 5. No, I mean 1 in 5, 11 to 14-year-olds, and you'll read something else that will mention a different age group or a different number or a different percentage, and it's fine. I think the bottom line of this is just to know that this is an important issue and it needs to be addressed. Girls as young and women between the ages of 16 and 24 experience the highest rate of dating violence. Among female victims, 94%, those aged 16 to 19, and 70% of those aged 20 to 24 were victimized by a current or former boyfriend or girlfriend. Violent behavior typically begins between the ages of 12 and 18. Don't forget about college students. And on our educational bookmarks that Drew pointed out to you earlier, and by the way, those are for free downloads. You'll see that in another one of my slides, that 43%, nearly half, and this is what's reported, so we know it's well over half, of dating college women report experience violent and abusive relationship behaviors, with 16% of them being sexually abused. The percentage of all young victims, males and females, in a dating abuse relationship is approximately 20%. The percentage of U.S. high school students students have been hit, slapped, pinched, physically hurt on purpose by their boyfriend or girlfriend in the last 12 months, which is approximately 10%. Nearly half of all women and men in the United States have experienced a psychological aggression by an intimate partner in their lifetime. And so overall, the prevalence of dating violence was higher among Black and Hispanic students compared to white students. Everyone's aware that a large number of young females are sexually abused, and unfortunately, the same awareness is not present concerning male victims. And remember, they don't report. Part of that is the embarrassment. Sometimes they even end up having questions about their own sexuality, particularly if they've been sexually abused by someone of the same sex. So this is the bookmark that was designed for college students. The reason this was a change from the original bookmark, the original card, these are less expensive. They can be downloaded and printed from the website for free. You can print as many as you want, put them together, pass them out to your patients, pass them out to students. It's really easy to do that. We don't have to mail them out anymore. We do have them. I have them in hand, and I use them when I do any lectures or anything that I do pass them out. You can certainly do that on your own as well. But the reason that these were designed is because we really wanted to make something that people wanted to keep. They wanted to reference. And so you notice that it's a bookmark, but it's also a ruler. It has, inches and centimeters. It's got statements on it about the abusive relationship, the 10 warning signs of an abusive relationship. It has math symbols. It has basically the link to video games. It has spelling errors. So this is something that we find college students really, really want. They really want to keep. So that was our goal in this, because it helps get the information out. Which one of our, as a small organization, one of our stumble points, how do we get the word out? This is like through you. The more you spread this information, send people to our website. Drew can speak to the number of people that contact the website or unique views. He keeps up with all those numbers. I don't have that in my head. He knows I don't keep numbers in my head anyway. But yeah, we just really want people to know this, and everything we offer is without fee. So abuse through college, and then now the ABCs of TDD. I like this as a mnemonic basically for any age group, even young people, but it's a good way of remembering what it's all about. And basically, A stands for anyone can be a victim. Violence basically is an equal opportunity abuse. Sexual orientation, social and economic status, certainly age within some restrictions, but if you're dating, absolutely it is an equal opportunity abuser. So anyone can be a victim. For B, we talk about be aware. Be yourself, be safe, be strong, be prepared to take action, which is the most important part of that message. And after being aware, be prepared. And I do actually, people in the old days when everyone wasn't running around with a cell phone, I certainly made sure that anyone that was in a dating relationship would have a couple of quarters with them to make a phone call so they can get help, they can get home. And I still tell people with cell phones, no phone numbers, because I can tell you right now, a lot of times abusers, they want to take your phone. And once they take your phone, if you don't know any numbers, I mean, I'll admit I know my husband's number. I don't know very many other phone numbers. And so you should always know at least a few numbers besides 911 to get some help. There's some great apps for your phone, but if your phone's taken, they're not going to do you any good. C is for control, because we know that abuse is about control. Healthy dating partner will not try to control you. So power and control. This is based on the Duluth model, and it's been modified for Jennifer Ann's group to fit into teen dating violence. Certainly, this is something else you can download from the website. You don't have to worry about copying it today or anything else, but you can copy it and even print it out. So violence, the power wheel has been developed by Jennifer Ann's group to more accurately address teen dating violence and the issues faced by teenagers. Again, you can print it out online. So it's a cycle where generally follows the pattern of, basically there is abuse. The abuser initiates verbal or physical abuse. It's designed to control the victim. It leads to potential for guilt. The abuser feels guilty for the abuse, mainly out of concern for being found out, not for sympathy for the victim. And then there are excuses and rationalization of the behavior, including blame and excuses, followed by, in quotes, normal behaviors. The abuser regains personal control, creates a peaceful phase, an attempt to make the victim feel good in the relationship again. And this is the hook. I ask my patients who are victims of any age group or any type of abuse to remember that. And if you don't remember it, it's not on the surface of your thinking, make some notes about things that have happened in that relationship. In the old days, again, where you couldn't have caller ID, I had patients who were picking up the phone and answering the phone to find their abuser on the other end, and they weren't prepared. So to me, if you prepare yourself, and they used to keep a note of sort of the abuses next to the phone, so that what they could do is remember that before they picked up the phone in case the abuser was there. You can block someone, but there are ways to get around that, so that sometimes those calls still do come in from people you don't want to talk to and people who are being abusive. So keep in mind, you have the right to remember that, to remind yourself to stay strong. This is for our patients. So remember that the perpetrator then begins the planning, certainly, for the next thing, looking for the wrong that the victim's going to do to justify more bad behavior. The plan's put into motion. The cycle of violence involves a pattern of ongoing control, emotional and physical and other forms of domestic violence can come into play at this point, which generally leads the victims to question the relationship. Kind of goes back to even the gaslighting. There's a lot of questioning about my own validity. What is my validity, my reality? And when you question your reality, that's when you can fall victim to these kinds of things. I did want to tell you a story of a woman a young girl by the name of Otrella Mosley. When I was in New York, was on one of the morning shows as expert in dating abuse. I was in the green room with the mother of Otrella Mosley, Carolyn Mosley, and really a sad story. This happened in Austin, Texas in 2003. Otrella Mosley was murdered by an ex-boyfriend in her high school hall. She was at Reagan High School, and right in front of her classmates, he stabbed her to death. And what happened with Otrella is an interesting story in itself, because it also speaks to how the system, in this case, the school system, the superintendent and the principals and the teachers really let her down. There was a history of abuse by Marcus McTear, who was the perpetrator, and he was the star football player. So as a result of that, a lot of people were looking the other way. And when the girls, one after the other, that dated Marcus and where he was abusive, they would go to the principal and complain about him, sometimes even together, several of them. And what they said was, leave him alone. Just basically leave him alone. And, that's certainly not the answer. But remember, he was a star football player. So they said, leave him alone. And the school left him alone. One of the previous victims told her mother, and she changed her daughter's school, and that basically saved her life. Because what happened to Otrella, who was next in line, she dated him for a while. She didn't want to date him anymore. She went to school one day. She was 15 years old, and she went to school one day, and basically he didn't like what she was wearing. This was at the end of their relationship, when we know that relationships can be more dangerous. So he basically ran after her, took a knife out of his backpack and stabbed her in the back. He pulled the knife out. She kept running. And she got to the stairs, and he had already stabbed her several times, to include stabbing her in the temple. And she fell down stairs right there in front of all of her classmates, and she was pronounced dead at the scene. But basically, when we look at this, we look at so many ways and times that this could have been stopped. But it still goes back to being open about these things, to share about these things, to pay attention about these things. What I do like about the story is that Carolyn Mosley, the mother, sued the school district, the superintendent, and the principal, and she won. The reason that I'm so pleased about that is because I'd like to think that those kinds of experiences for the school district and the principal and the superintendent are going to make people think differently when this kind of information comes to them. So what are the controversial issues? Basically, we look at the problem of he said, she said, because what's the proof? When someone's complaining about it, you can say, well, she agreed, she gave me consent, and she says, no, she didn't, or vice versa. He said that there was no consent. So we have to understand that having a witness to the victimization is key. And so I think without that, sometimes it really doesn't get reported, because people recognize that their case, in a sense, is weak, like the cases of dating abuse that I mentioned earlier. I mean, it's a he said, she said without that witness. That doesn't mean that people shouldn't, do something about it, but it means that they have to be realistic in running what's going to happen. So one of the most controversial parts that isn't always clear, that the victim is or isn't a willing participant. And so, you have to see what you can do to make that more evident. The only resolution is having a witness. And then there's a witness experience that one of my patients had. She went to a party, and she was handed a beer when she walked in, and she knew better than take something that was already opened or whatever. But it was a new beer, as she described it. He had already drugged it. He was looking for someone to give it to. He gave it to her, and she did willingly go into a shed in the back of this yard party, and basically was willing to at least make out with this guy. She didn't want to have sex with him. He did rape her. The person she went to the party with, which was a male friend, was looking for her. He opens up the door of the shed. He sees what's going on, but he sees she's not fighting. Well, she was drugged. And so that was a witness, but then they did question the validity of what he saw and what it meant. So again, there's a lot of issues with he said, she said. Initial consent can be withdrawn at any time. I think we all know that today. But, what happens when, like that dating one I told you about, where she invites him into the apartment, how do you change your mind there and make sure that he understands that? I'm not saying that shouldn't be done. I'm just saying that it's certainly a tricky scenario. We have to stop and encourage our patients to see what part of what they're doing and saying are they giving messages that may not be the message they want to give. Secrecy, and that is, it's common for the victims. Sometimes they have a fear of sharing the abuse, and the victim certainly is worried about the information getting out. It can lead to, friends telling them to leave the relationship. They're not ready to leave a relationship. They're not prepared to leave a relationship, so they really don't tell anybody. When I was working at the 121st Evac Hospital in Seoul, Korea, I had an interesting flip because I had a lot of male GIs that were being physically abused by their new brides. And I think that there was a cultural issue there for sure, but without, going into detail about it, they really didn't want anyone else to know. They did share that in therapy and we would talk to them about it, but they absolutely, certainly did not want any of their buddies to know. They didn't want the commanders to know. And so it was a great secret that unfortunately held them hostage. So some individuals would rather be in an abusive relationship than not be in a relationship at all. They are financially or otherwise dependent, maybe just even emotionally dependent on, their abuser. And I can tell you that I have a housekeeper that's been with me, 37 years, 38 years. I can't remember how long. She's part of the family now. But I can tell you that she was being abused. I have permission to talk about her. She was being abused by her alcoholic husband. And we had some incredibly good programs here in El Paso that I had no knowledge of before this. But the program basically helped her become educated and learn to speak English. After that, they educated her to become a bookkeeper. And then they helped her find a home. It was a HUD home. But they did so much hand holding through the process that I was pretty excited about what they were able to do for her. So keep in mind, you can check your community, see what's available. Hopefully, if not now, soon there'll be those kind of programs available again. But it certainly helped her turn her life around. So Drew is going to talk to you a little bit more about consent as it relates to all of this. And so I will turn it over to him. Drew.
Thank you. Let's see if I can get this set up correctly. Okay. That's a lot of screens that are open. Let me.
I don't see me anymore, so.
Okay. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit is now I'm going to talk about the issue of consent. Again, similar to what I was talking about earlier with gaslighting, I was really pleased when, during Me Too and they started talking more and more on the news about consent and the importance of consent, and look at all these people who aren't, they're doing non-consensual things and they've been getting away with it for a long time. But very often what I was hearing in the news was they weren't presenting the information correctly. It's very frustrating. I have a law degree. Consent is a legal term of art. So in some ways, it was very frustrating hearing them talking about consent in ways that were inaccurate. But the other thing about that, as a legal term of art, that means consent can mean different things in different jurisdictions. So what we've done when we decided to come up with these consent games, we went with the affirmative consent, which is really the model of consent that we're going to. If not all jurisdictions have this definition now, they will. So essentially, consent is informed, it's freely given, it's actively given, it's revocable. So informed, that means that you need to understand what it is you're consenting to. One example of this is a statutory rape. The reason it's statutory rape is by law, they've decided if you are 12 years old, you're unable to fully appreciate the consequences of what sexual intercourse is. You don't fully appreciate that, therefore it can never truly be informed, no matter who you are. The government has said, by statute, they have said this is statutory rape. It's not informed. It has to be freely given. For example, if you work somewhere and your boss is insisting that you engage in whatever sexual activities with them in order to keep your job, and you agree to it, you're not consenting to it. You are agreeing to it because you have no option. So this is coercive behavior. So it has to be freely given. It also has to be actively given. Actively given means if you are passed out or you are too drunk to understand what's going on, you cannot actively be giving that consent. And then, of course, it's revocable. So just because you've had a boyfriend or girlfriend for the past 6 months, when you run into them again 5 years from now in the mall, they're not allowed to go ahead and start kissing them in front of their new boyfriend or girlfriend. So it's revocable, it's actively given, it's freely given, it's informed. Rather than understanding every different aspect of different scenarios about consent, we think if you focus on these 4 elements, you will understand what consent is. And I might not have been very clear about this, but obviously what we're doing with Jennifer Ann's group, we're not nearly as focused on people who've been in abusive relationships or people whose consent was not acknowledged up front. What we're trying to do is we're trying to prevent these instances from happening in the future. And during the COVID-19, this is one of the values that we see with these games. Is again, we want these games to be ubiquitous. So if you're learning at home or whatever your situation is, because the games are available through so many different channels, we really feel like we have kind of we've tried from the very beginning to remove as many barriers as possible from people learning about this important information. So although distance learning right now is unfortunately necessary for a lot of people, and a lot of people are getting very tired of it, and I understand that, I think it's really helpful to realize that this is also possibly a good environment for parents to possibly sit down with their young people in their lives and see this as an opportunity to maybe say, hey, I want you to play this game. After you play it, why don't we have a conversation about the game? So this is a real, we think, helpful way to try and initiate these conversations that are otherwise problematic in some ways by providing this resource where you could talk about the characters in the game without really talking as much about the student or the child themselves. So these consent games, we basically have them from being appropriate for all ages up until being appropriate for high school or college students. We think something like consent should be taught early and should be taught often. We understand that schools might not want to talk about sex, especially depending what part of the country you're in. Adrift is a really good example of a game that never talks about sex at all, because consent is not just about sex. When the police pull you over for a speeding ticket and they say, may I look in your car? They're asking for your consent. And if you say yes, and then 30 seconds later say no, you can revoke that consent. If you say you can look in my car, but you can't look in the trunk, you have control. Consent matters. It matters in a lot of ways. So Adrift is this really cute little game where basically you, all of your interactions having to do with consent are you're interacting with these terminals, these computer terminals. So you're a space miner, and you found this abandoned spaceship that's run by this computer, by an AI. And you interact with the AI because the AI says, hey, would you mind going ahead and retrieving all of this data and then taking it back to your ship so I don't have to stay on this abandoned spaceship forever? And it gives you a series of steps to follow in order to do this. So they're kind of like mini puzzles, and there's 4 or 5 of them in the game. And each one of them is a different scenario around consent, but it has nothing to do with sex. So it's appropriate for all ages. And that's really my main point about this game. And I think I think the more opportunities we find to engage people at a very young age about consent, the better. Let's see. There's another game, Crossing Boundaries. I'm not going to go through that. I'll go quickly on this one. And again, you get to choose your character. They're both triangles, but one is kind of a boy triangle and one is kind of a girl triangle. But again, you get to choose your gender. We're trying as hard as possible to be as inclusive as possible. Well, 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 what do we have here? A new dancer? Excellent. My name is Orca. I'm here to teach you the latest dance craze, the blurble blobble. Now, what's your name? Wait, never mind. I have a name for you, and it is Triangle Boy. And I won't go through the game except to tell you that basically what you're learning in this game is you're learning a series of dance moves. And Orca tells you, well, first thing you have to do is you have to find someone you want to dance with. Then you have to introduce yourself. And then you have to ask them if they want to dance. And so again, we're learning about this special kind of permission that we call consent, and just bringing that home over and over about what consent means. So for example, once you've learned a few dance moves and you found someone to dance with, you can't just assume they always want to do that dance move. Later in the game, your dance partner shows up and they've been drinking. So you say, whoa, Orca says, whoa, you can't really dance with them because they've been drinking. So they're not really in a position to tell you if they're able to dance or not. So again, we're trying to make sure that it's actively given, freely given, it's informed, and it's revocable. One of the interesting things about this game is this is the game that got the people in Vanuatu to contact us. They really liked this game. And so they said, hey, can you create a version of this for people living in Vanuatu? And so what we did was we created this game that, in addition to talking about consent, it also teaches them about respect. They said, you know, the young people living here don't really have a lot of role models when it comes to understanding what steps I should go through to progress a relationship. And so through this game, you start where you dance, and then you can hold hands, and you can hug. Then at the very end of the game, you kiss. And that's, I mean, that's the end of the game. That's as far as we're going, of course, with that. But I'll just show you very briefly a little bit about this. We tried to make this game as culturally relevant as possible. We worked with people in Vanuatu who helped create all of the scenarios. They sent us photos of all of the different settings so that we could make it so it would reflect Vanuatu life. And then they also helped us create the characters. And then the entire game is in Bislama. So to try and make it authentic. Another nice thing is, so we have a female, male, and gender neutral character. So we were able to do this, and World Vision Vanuatu was absolutely fine with us doing this. We thought, again, I'm so impressed with them. I'm so impressed with how open-minded and progressive they are, that not only did they buy into us using video games for this serious topic to engage young people, they're absolutely fine with us representing same-sex relationships and gender-neutral characters. So you have a narrator here who's, I'll tell you, he's basically saying, hey, thanks for coming here, but I see you're not dancing. Don't worry, I'm going to teach you how to dance. Are you ready? Once you're ready, push start. And it says, that's great. Now let's go ahead and find a partner for you. And what you have to do is first you have to look around, then you have to introduce yourself, then you have to ask them to dance. And I know more Bislama than I ever thought I would know, because of course I had to do I had to manage this project on all the translations. So first thing you do is you look around, which is look. And then you find your partner. And again, we can have a same-sex, gender-neutral, or so we'll just do the gender-neutral character. And before you ask them to dance, first you should say hi to them, because that's just polite. Now, once you get that right, the music starts, because the music here is part of the reward. So you've got this fairly simple beat. And as you continue to get this right, it will add a little more complexity to the beat. Again, the point here is that it's rewarding you for getting it right. You tough. And then it wants you, and then if you went ahead and you just started dancing right away, no, you can't do that. First, you have to ask them to dance before you just start dancing with them. This is a really cool little game. I'm very pleased with it. obviously I don't have time to go through it, but one thing I do want to share is that in the US, well, anywhere, I guess, when you're talking about meaningful games or games intended to change people in a positive way, there's an organization in New York called Games for Change. They have a large annual conference and they also have awards. And this game, actually, we were a finalist for most meaningful impact, which meant a lot to me. There were only 4 games that they chose, and I'm proud to say that we lost to UNICEF. I feel like in some ways losing to UNICEF is probably better than winning, because then people think that we are as wonderful as UNICEF, and we're not. But I'm really pleased with what we did, and I'm very proud of what we were able to do with that game. Um, Crossing Boundaries is another really great game. You'll have the link to it. I would suggest exploring it when you have time. It's for a slightly older group. It's about 3 students who've just graduated from school. They're traveling around the world, and as they're traveling around the world, they experience different things in different cultures and little scenarios that have to do with consent. And not all of them have to do with sex. For example, at one point, somebody puts, one of the players says, "I really don't like hot food." And when they leave to go to the restroom, one of the other players puts hot, spicy chilies in their food, and that's an issue as well. So it explores consent in many different ways. Again, it's about permission. It's a special type of permission, and I think the more we provide examples of it, the better people will understand it rather than feeling like they're having to memorize it. This really needs to become common sense for people, and we think that this is the way to do it. Um, I'll quickly go into this. This is the most mature of our games that have been published so far. Um, it's it includes between 8 and 10 different non-consensual scenarios, and it's it has some content that could be problematic. It is appropriate for high school students, but we do suggest that parents or educators play the game first. We also, although you really want to play through the entire game because it's a narrative, it's one big story with several vignettes throughout it. It does have a lesson mode, and if you go through the lesson mode, you're able to skip ahead to certain parts, like if you're in a classroom and this is what the topic you're covering. Another thing that is nice about this, you can customize the character to some extent here. There are studies that show that the more closely you identify with the avatar, sometimes the more meaningful that game becomes to you. We also do have this content warning checkbox here. Some of the more problematic content, although it's not shown on screen, you're able to skip even the reference to it if you check this. So again, we're trying as hard as possible to be very trauma informed, especially when we're talking about consent. I really don't have time to go into this game. I would say it's worth playing. I think it's a fairly compelling game. It's about 45 minutes or an hour to play through. And now I want to talk about a game that this is the first time we've shared this with anybody. This year's theme for our games is culture. We wanted to talk about what impact does culture have on attitudes and beliefs regarding dating and healthy relationships. So as I mentioned earlier, if you were to rely on movies and TV, you would think it would be acceptable to stalk people because that would be romantic in some way, or I don't know what they're trying to achieve with that, but it's very unhealthy. People are absolutely getting the wrong learning the wrong messages through that. And so this year's theme was culture, and we've got a total of 8 games that I don't know when we're going to have time to release all of them, but one of those games is called 1,000 Cuts. And so not only does it kind of explore a campus culture to some extent, it does it through talking about the process you go through for Title IX. So I think this is going to fit in really well with our other consent games for college students, because we would like for them to have a better understanding of what Title IX, how that works. We know this is a constantly moving target. So this basically is the time frame for this game is, I think, 2016, because of course Title IX has changed dramatically since then, and of course we expect it to change dramatically again. But again, it's to give them a general idea, and it's a game where it's replicating instant SMS text messages. Turn this on. And so we've just got a series of text messages, and it's got this, I mean, it's a very beautiful aesthetic. They've done a wonderful job with this. Elisabeth Belau, she created this while she was in her, well, throughout her education, but she finished it just before she graduated from NYU, their, I think, writing program. So she's a wonderful writer. She's really done a great job of bringing these characters to life. And it's basically a branching dialogues, kind of like choose your own adventure, where you have different dialogue options. And depending on what you choose to do, it changes the direction that the story goes in. Her intention is to really expand upon this at some point in the future. But for now, what we have is still quite exhaustive. And there's several different outcomes. And I'm really not able to go through it right now, especially since we know it's still a work in progress. But I'm hoping that this game we might be able to release it in December, at least some version of it. So this is probably going to be the first game from our culture series that we're able to release. And I think, yeah, that's pretty much all I have on consent. And so what I'm going to do now is I'll remind you that links to all these games, except for this one, the 1,000 Cuts, since that's not available yet, links to everything else to either play it or download it or to read the statistics are going to be in the link at the very end of the presentation. And so back to you, Dr. Richeson.
Okay, easier said than done.
Yeah, I know.
Let me make sure I've done everything I'm supposed to. Yeah, it keeps bringing me to a different screen, and someone somewhere knows why that is, but I'm going to go ahead and catch up. There we go, not too far. So the first thing I wanted to say, Drew, because you didn't mention it, I don't think, unless I missed it, about the game contest. The way these video games come to Jennifer Ann's group is that Drew holds a video game contest every year. He picks a theme. The first few years there was just generic, but then we picked some very specific themes like culture, I guess, what else? What other
gaslighting, consent, bystanders.
Bystander awareness.
Right, right. So yeah, and I'll just say real quickly, one of the really wonderful things about that. So this year was culture. The first place game got $10,000, which is that's a big pill to swallow when you're a very small organization. But you know, we have to give, I feel like, sufficient awards for people to spend months creating these games. And one of the exciting things is that as a result of kind of releasing this to the world, we have got so many different countries that have participated in this contest. This year's contest, the first place game is from France, second place game is from Portugal. The third place game is the one I just showed you from the US. But we've had games from Argentina, Belgium, Canada, France, India, Ireland. I go through alphabetically: Mexico, Sweden, Spain, Thailand. I may have said Thailand already. The UK, the US, and of course the game we created with the people in Vanuatu. But I don't know, maybe like 15 countries. And that's another thing that I really like, is that we're engaging young people to start thinking about creating these games, and we get to see the cultural influence from those countries. And then when those games are released, the game from India did really well in India in the App Store. I would just see tons of people in India and Pakistan playing that game. And that's wonderful, because our goal is to try and directly reach young people. And I'll talk about this forever if I'm given the opportunity to, so I'm going to stop now. Back to you.
Well, so the whole point is to really, we certainly want to educate El Paso, Texas. And Drew wants to educate the country, and there are people who want to educate the world. Well, we think that if you look at this globally, you know, that the more people that get invested in this, that it will have a profound global effect. And that does then help this country and El Paso and Austin and every place else. So we just want to not only educate youth, but we want to educate the world in essence. And I don't think that's too big a deal when you think about the way we are available via internet. What I wanted to add, Drew will laugh, I'm sure, but I'm one of the, we've got some incredible judges that are in the video game field and journalists and wonderful people with big names. And then there's me. This year we actually had Pat De Leon, but that was kind of cute too. He's no more technologically savvy than me. Well, in fact, I think less than me. But I am the psychologist on this group. And I always tease that says that I think I'm chosen because Drew figures that if I can play the game, anybody can play it. This is not my forte by any stretch of the imagination. But anyway, I do appreciate the opportunity to be part of that because looking at what people have done so creatively to educate, to prevent, which is again the theme, educate to prevent, educate to prevent. So looking here at the progression of unhealthy relationships, you know, this is kind of something we all are aware of, you know, that those unhealthy early dating, those healthier early dating relationships are not always honest early dating experiences. But it is the time that people become invested in the relationship. And therefore, it gets to be harder to remove yourself because you remember those good old days in the beginning. So all relationships begin with the best behavior, as we know. Abuse doesn't start until there's really some form of commitment and investment in the relationship. It's early dating as the honeymoon period, if you will. Psychological abuse, hurtful name calling, demeaning a person, intimate partner violence, domestic violence, all of this is, you know, sort of as it moves forward through the process of going from early on the surface healthy relationship to the cycle of violence and things to consider. I think that if you look at the psychological abuse, you can be seen as a way to prepare the person to tolerate additional abuse because it is very subtle in its onset. Intimate partner abuse is the progression of the relationship that has included intimacy, the next step in the relationship, and that's typically where there's a greater commitment to it. Domestic violence is violence, by the way, against one person or another in a setting such as a marriage or cohabitation, and it can also involve violence against children, even if they're observers of violence. They're still a part of that abuse. So what about the battered person syndrome? This is something that I talk to my patients about with some frequency, not using the terms battered person, but to me, it's really important to look at it because it's very similar to the whole issue of learned helplessness. Excuse me, I dropped a paper. So we know, you might remember that in the mid 60s, there was Dr. Martin Seligman who did a study, excuse me, with dogs, and that was learned helplessness. And I was so impressed with that study. I talk about that study with great frequency. If you don't remember, let me just give you the highlights of it. Basically, the highlight is that they were doing an experiment with dogs, and he noticed that the dogs didn't try to escape from the shocks that they had been conditioned to believe that they couldn't escape from. So what they did is they had dogs in a kennel, and there were two kennels kind of attached to each other, and one was electrified on the bottom, and the other one wasn't. And then initially, I don't know if I get it all in details, but nonetheless, the point being is that the dog initially could explore, and then later on, when the electrical current came on, they could leave and get away from, and eventually blocked the escape, and the dog would go over and sit down, tolerate, accept. Then the block was removed, but the dog no longer tried to escape. Because at that point, the dog believed, if you will, the dog believes, I think they do, I've got two puppies that believe, that the dog believed it couldn't escape anymore. And that's really when we look at the battered person syndrome, they no longer look for escape, try to escape, they don't believe they can escape for a variety of reasons. But that's really the person that we have to work the hardest with because they've given up trying to get away from. So the cycle of a violence comes from the tension building, the acute violence, reconciliation, back to the honeymoon, the calm, Another part of the cycle is for those who are battered then become abusers, and if not, they may have learned to be helpless in the description that I had just given. So students that are victims of physical dating violence are significantly more likely to have lower than average grade point averages and perhaps potentially have fewer life options. They might even drop out of school. And so that leads to further entrapment by virtue of those fewer options. Victims are often very intimidated by considering options such as leaving an abusive relationship, and they liken it to the fear of pain of, I always liken it to the fear of pain of walking on a bed of hot coals. I always tell my patients that, yes, it's uncomfortable, it's very painful, but it's short-lived. And if you can remember that, then you can get out of it, because otherwise you take that hotbed of coal and it might not be quite so hot, but you're dragging it out for a whole lifetime. We want to look at the difference of getting beyond this initial fear, pain, discomfort, and recognizing that there are good options at the end of that. Okay, it still doesn't want to move for me. Let me try this first. There we go. Okay, so we want to help our patients evaluate their relationship. And I like to say this a lot. It's not okay. Because people say, yeah, you know, he slapped me, but he said sorry. That's not okay. He slapped me and said sorry and brought me soup. It's not okay. Because a lot of times the victims will look at what was the trade-off. Yeah, this happened, but then this happened. Those are the flowers that came in, you know, after she did this or that. She brings flowers home. It's not okay. So you've got to remember to help our patients see that it's not the makeup part, it's the whole big picture, because they want to look at the positive and want to continue to believe they're loved and feel loved, but not in the way that they should be loved. So I talk about that a lot in terms of what's okay. Some of the real concrete questions you can ask your patients, ask themselves. Do you like how you're treated by your partner? Are you asked what you like to do and feel free to choose without your partner getting upset? One warning sign is that you're feeling pressured to do what you don't want to do. In or out of the bedroom, if you're pressured to do what you don't want to do like how you're treated? Do you like how you treat the other person? You know, what kind of anger and animosity comes up where you become an abuser as well? The third is, do you like how you treat yourself in the relationship? For example, do you feel comfortable being the person you are comfortable being? A warning sign is that you act differently just to get along or keep the peace. Do you like how the other person treats themselves? For example, the dating partner is honest with themselves. A warning sign should be if the other person needs to show off to impress you. How about, does the person like how they are treated in the relationship? It's not okay for someone to try to control what you do, asking who you're with, what you're wearing, or demanding immediate response. Even when married or dating, it's important to have personal time with friends and family. What if they start controlling who you're with? A lot of times a perpetrator begins to make your lifestyle smaller and smaller so that it's just with them. And that's certainly very unhealthy. If someone you're dating sends you controlling messages that cut you into your private time, it's not okay. It can be hard, but we have to support the need for our patients to let their partner know what is okay and what is not okay. I'm always concerned, of course, that I don't want to put someone in a position of encouraging the abuse from the other person or bringing up the abuse or making it happen by virtue of they go home and they kind of set a limit. We have to hold their hands in the process of doing this in a way that isn't going to put them in further danger. So it's, how should they feel if someone was checking, how would you feel if someone was checking your social media? You've got to get people to understand it's not okay. A respectful relationship is built on trust. It's not okay for someone to monitor where you are and what you're doing and who you're with. We do ask people to keep their passwords secret. You know, I know that some people share all of their passwords and everything to everybody, but in some relationships, it's just not healthy to do it. It's not good to do that, you know, regardless of what it is. I've had a lot of people that are in reasonably normal relationships, whatever that means. It could be a marriage, and then they move toward divorce. I can't tell you how many times I've heard people abusing the ability to use their passwords. I actually know people who have had those passwords used to send, bad messages in terms of their financial status, move money around, close out their accounts where they weren't getting notifications of bill due. I mean, all kinds of things. So sharing passwords, even in the context of a marriage, sometimes isn't the safest or best thing to do. Just have to be careful with all of that. And people, I think, are very naive about it. I've worked with a lot of people going through divorce who said, oh, my husband, my wife would never do those things to me. And I hope that's true, but my experience with those people have found out that most of the time they do. And if not, sometimes, I'm sorry, Drew, is having a law degree, but sometimes we've got ruthless attorneys who encourage that behavior. And even though the husband or wife wouldn't have thought that on their own, but sometimes we have some attorneys here in El Paso, I do know that, who will say things like, come on, let's get all the money and let's do this, or let's hurt this. And I'm like, okay, that's certainly unhealthy and abuse by any other name, for sure. So what about awareness and prevention? And more important than ever, we have to look at some of these things, because if you can prevent and prevent at a young age, if you can be aware, if you can help the parents be aware, I mean, those are the things that we're really moving toward. We want desperately to have people understand this from every angle that they can, because if they can understand it, they can prevent it, they can educate, they can encourage people to see all of those things that have come about. So today we've been talking about the important issues in awareness and prevention in relationship, but especially during quarantine. So to come back to that. So here's the issue here. While we know that it might not be as likely that you're quarantined with your boyfriend if you're a teenager, but you are basically quarantined by virtue of that cyber abuse potential, even though they may not be physically able for the boyfriend or girlfriend to strike you, they can strike you verbally, they can strike you, emotionally. So there's still potential for increasing abuse. And the more that I've been working with patients, I would say even most especially probably this last week and a half, 2 weeks in El Paso with these marketing, I can tell you that people are just really struggling right now. And so the despondency is there. And with the despondency comes acting out sometimes in either direction, withdrawing or acting out against another person. So we can't be naive about that. But whether we're on quarantine or not, whether we have COVID or not, this pandemic of abusive relationship is there. And unless we do something about it, it will continue to grow. So there's a wide variety of resources preventing relationship abuse. They are easy to find. They are easy to use, except maybe during quarantine. I think there's still some ways to get to them, but you have to be, or your victim has got to be a little bit more cautious, and maybe they can't, and my heart certainly goes out to people that feel physically trapped while going through this, on top of everything else, physically trapped in an abusive relationship of sorts, verbal again, or otherwise. There's never been a time that I have spoken to a group of people where someone didn't come up to me after the talk and said, let me tell you about my experience. Rarely it'll be someone that says, let me tell you about my sister's experience or my brother's experience. But people have these issues in their history, and it almost feels like everyone does. And so, helping people understand the prevalence of this helps us understand how to get people to talk about this and to reach out for help. Because I think that without that, we're not going to get a change. We have to tell patients that there is help, and to include anonymous online or phone help, with access being much more challenging during this time. But if the victim is quarantined with an abuser, there's still some types of help. It's just, again, they have to be a little more creative. Maybe it goes back to what we said earlier about safe words, to be prepared in advance. I mean, we're in it right now, but if there's a way that someone can be prepared in advance. I really like the idea of our medical partners really doing some screening. The pediatric association do actually encourage screening of patients when they know their patients are dating, anytime there's a change in a relationship. But I will tell you, the pediatricians I know, and I have great respect for them, they don't have the time or take the time to do that. So I think if nothing else, we can get our medical personnel, the frontline people, the person who steps in after the physician leaves the room, to ask some of these pertinent questions about relationships. I had a young woman in an abusive relationship, and I had been seeing her probably 6 months and had no idea. There was no evidence of it. There was no reach out about it, nothing about it, until she said one day, could she bring her boyfriend in with her? I said, yeah, I think you could do that. Sure. If it's okay with your parents, let's go ahead and have him come in. And I thought it would be a good idea just to kind of lay eyes on him. But I have to tell you, it was within the first 5 minutes I saw the abuse. And I'm sure that that's what she wanted. She didn't have the ability, or maybe was too afraid to say something. Maybe she was doubting her own judgment of that. But it was absolutely an abusive relationship, very controlling. And with her permission too, we got parents involved. We actually ended up getting a protective order. That was the degree to which there was abuse. So, take the time to evaluate, see if we can get other professionals to evaluate where they should. And so we still want to help people stay safe. We know that abusive relationships rarely get better. They often get worse. And it's important to help those that are victimized understand that. It's also important to help individuals identify real dangers and what to do to extricate themselves safely. We know that the end of a relationship is the most dangerous. Physical abuse doesn't always lead to homicide, but it can. And I think there's a real naivete in thinking, oh, it would never get to that point. It's not often that someone sits down and says, I'm going to kill this partner of mine. Sometimes it's being out of control with their violence. In the case of Jennifer Ann, it was a planned murder by an ex-boyfriend, but a lot of times it's someone like with the lacrosse players. I'm blocking the name right now. I'm sorry.
Yardley Love.
Thank you very much. Yardley Love. Her perpetrator and herself, they were both lacrosse players, and they were drinking. They were having a long conversation. Some of the information goes, and he was shaking her and hitting her head against the wall. And then he left, not knowing how badly she had been injured. And the roommate found her already dead. So, it's just that you've got to recognize that the risks are there. And we really have got to pay attention to those risks and earlier on, because we don't want them to lead to those kinds of things. So there's so many names that Drew and I both know. They get in touch with Jennifer Ann's group sometimes. They reach out for help. Sometimes they reach out just to talk about what their experience has been. We've had aunts about their nephews. We've had certainly a lot of mothers and fathers reach out, telling their sad stories. And they're all sad, sad stories. Most of them that reach out post-mortem. They reach out because they have lost someone to murder. The violence has gone to that degree. There was another case in El Paso. These are certainly common all over the country, but I still remember the one where he showed up to look for his ex-girlfriend, and the mother answered the door. So he shot the mother, and then he also found her. I think he shot her as well. This was actually one of the teachers here in El Paso. I can go on and on and on with stories, but I think it's probably you've heard enough. So Drew, did you want to add anything? I do want to say, by the way, for purposes of just giving you the whole story, Drew's my son. And so we've been working together. I have a private practice that keeps me very busy, but we've been working together for Jennifer Ann's group. He works exclusively for Jennifer Ann's group, or with Jennifer Ann's group. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. That was very loud. I thought I muted my phone. I apologize. But anyway, so Drew, I'm sorry. Is there anything that you wanted to add?
No, I mean, I think that's it. Other than I do hope that you do download the PDF document at the end and look through the different resources. It includes, for example, here, jenniferann.org/TPA2020. It's a PDF. I think it's like 5 pages. In addition to the links to the games, it also has links to the 2 studies that have already been published in peer-reviewed journals evaluating our games, showing these are preliminary studies, but showing that they are effective after a single gameplay of changing unhealthy beliefs or attitudes regarding relationship norms and acceptance of basically abusive behavior. We're hopeful that we will eventually get a longitudinal study if we ever got the funding for it. We would love a longitudinal study. If any of you have relationships with universities and are looking for a really, I think, compelling, interesting topic for a dissertation or something like that, absolutely contact me. I'm speaking with somebody from a university in New York right now about just that thing. I'm always looking for people who are interested in doing things with our games. And one thing we have, I have the source code and the licensing rights to all these games, and we haven't published all of them. I have over 60 of these games. And one thing we could do that I find very interesting is we could, for example, make a change to the source code of one of the games and then use that as the control and use the exact same change, the exact same game with the dynamic turned on. It would be much easier to control to compare the control versus the intervention that way. And those are the kinds of things we can do since we have access to so many of these games. So absolutely, please do get in touch if you have any interest in that or any questions. We're always looking for people to work with. It's a very small organization. It's mostly me. I'm doing this out of my house, my sunroom. And Dr. Richeson, my mom, is the head of our advisory board, but I'm the only like full-time staff person. So I would love to find more people to partner with.
Here's the list of references from my talk. I apologize, the last two, I couldn't format it. No matter what I did, I couldn't change the way it was formatted. That second from the bottom is the one that basically hasn't been in print yet, but it is in process of print for 2021. And again, it speaks specifically in that one article about mass shootings and the relatedness. But yeah, some of the wonderful stuff that's online, keeping in mind that these numbers change all the time. And it's so important just to recognize that the numbers are just too large. And that's the most important thing to remember. So Q&A, and I'm not sure exactly how to access, because I did for a while and then it disappeared. But if you have some questions, this is the time. And we do have time to answer those questions. I know that we can get Logan back in if we need help from TPA to orchestrate that. So how do I know if there's questions? Drew, are you still there with Huva and you can see questions if they come in?
Yes, and Logan actually has just now also added the SurveyMonkey link.
Oh, good.
I'm not
good.
sure what that's for, but I think you all know what that's for.
Well, you do need to fill that out if you want your credit hours. So
Yeah.
make sure you go to that. The suggestion, according to Jessica, our ED, it's going to be up, I think, the rest of the time, the convention, but I did see an earlier recommendation that you should do that as soon as something has ended. So if the link is already up, then you're set to go with that. So if you have any questions, you put it into your Huva, and don't know what that means. I mean, I do know what a Huva is, but I just don't know. There's an acronym for something, but nonetheless, type in your questions. Let's see. Do we have a question? What does that say? You raised your hand. I love that you raised your hand. Now, what do I do with you? Let's see if we find Carrie. Maybe I can let Carrie talk. Ask to unmute. Okay, Carrie, unmute.
Okay.
Oh, good.
Okay. Are there? So I'm wondering how this looks in terms of like the online dating stuff that was already really growing, but then like online dating is sort of the primary way that people can be known, right? And so I know that I talk a lot about online dating, but I also see how, I don't know, it just seems to put people at different kind of risk perhaps. How do you coach people with online dating and signs and signals of, warning signs and such?
And not to be an alarmist, but I do tell people that you're going into an unknown situation with an unknown person, no matter how long you've been texting or talking or anything else. And so to me, it's just the common sense kind of stuff of, the first time you meet someone, you meet in a public venue, you have maybe some kind of a short thing, like let's just meet for coffee. I do ask people, if you have someone that you can, let somebody else know what you're doing and who you're going to be with. It's just sort of that logical kind of stuff, because I do have people who say, oh, we've been talking for 2 weeks now. I know him or her. oh, I know they're safe. And of course, it's that naivete that people of every age seems to continue to have. And maybe it's the hopefulness. Maybe that's where naivete comes from. It's the hopefulness. But to me, it's some of that logical kinds of things that we encourage people to do. Did that answer your question?
It does. I didn't know if maybe there was something that I wasn't thinking of. And I think also, it's the naivete, but it's also right now, I think it's the loneliness that
Oh,
people
for
might
sure.
be more willing to accept certain kinds of behaviors because I have so many folks who are alone in this quarantine 7 months now, and they are just like really struggling with that. So just didn't know if maybe there might be something that I could be missing, but that's helpful to hear again. Thank you.
Well, I'll just add one more piece to that. I just had a patient tell me that in their loneliness, they had invited a friend over, but because it was a friend, they didn't use masks. And because it
Oh,
was a friend, they actually shared drinks. And I did ask if it was a sexual relationship. He said, absolutely not. We were just sitting on the couch next to each other. She has just been identified as positive for COVID. And so one of the things he told me is that he was going in for a test. But I mean, it's even that, it's that desperation to just kind of normalize. He invites this person over, no mask, share drinks. It may not play out well for him, but even outside the context of meeting people that are strangers, we've got to make good decisions about staying safe within the context of this COVID pandemic, not just the relationship pandemic. Other questions? Well, you guys are great, and you're really quiet. I guess because you were all muted. So,
well, I'll tell you, they've been writing some wonderful comments.
oh, nice.
Yes, it is really nice. I don't think I'll read them out loud because it will be too self-congratulatory, but I really appreciate it. I spend a lot of time not being able to interact with people. So it's
Just muted you. Are you?
there.
There you go, Drew. I
Yeah.
muted you. I'm so
Um,
sorry.
that's all right. So it's thank you so much for all the wonderful things people are saying. It's I believe very much in this approach to prevention, especially when we're talking about sensitive issues and we're talking about adolescence. I just keep thinking back to myself and what conversations I was or was not willing to have with my mother or father. And I know that exploring an otherwise tricky situation through a video game at my own pace without anybody judging me or looking over my shoulder is absolutely what I would have opted to do. And I just assume that there's many other young people who feel the same way. And so to the extent that this is becoming more commonplace in terms of using video games for serious issues, I'm thrilled because we published our first game in 2008. And at that time, when I said we're going to use video games to prevent violence, it was like I had an eye in the middle of my head. People thought that that was just nonsense. But I didn't see why not. And so we've tried it. We've tried many different things, but without question, this use of video games is the thing that I feel is very, very promising. I just would love to get it to the next level so that I didn't have to keep explaining it to people, that people just were like, oh, of course, that makes sense. Because I think once you read up on it, if you read the white paper, I think that will help. I think it becomes very obvious once you've been really exposed to it. So thanks again for all the really wonderful things that you guys have said, and also just for you being here and paying attention and choosing to listen to this presentation. I don't often get an opportunity to speak at so many conferences as I have this year. So as terrible as the pandemic has been, it's been really helpful for me to speak at conferences without having to spend money for airfare and hotel and all that. I'm in Atlanta, so this has been tremendous. I appreciate everybody's attention and interest.
Thank you. I hope everybody has a wonderful day and a safe day.
Yes, Carrie, all the games are free. And if you download, can you go up back one slide, Mom?
Hopefully.
Yeah.
Sure. Can I do it? Will I do it? I don't know. Let's see.
No, you went the wrong way.
Oh, yeah.
So it's jenniferann.org/TPA2020. If you
Sorry.
type that into your browser, you'll get a PDF that's like, it's like 5 pages or so. Oh, here, I'll type in this. Duh. I wasn't thinking.
Oh, please do.
jenniferann.org/TPA2020. And it's a PDF with links in it that'll bring you to the games. And not all games are available for all platforms, but that's one of the things. Given enough time, I would love it if all the games were available on iOS, all of them Android, all of them browser. But that's the end game. Right now, the budget doesn't really allow for us to necessarily do that. And we have some of the games. We have one game that even is in French. You can play it in French or English. The game Honeymoon, the healthy relationship game, that's available in Spanish or English. So we're trying what we can, but we can't be especially proactive given our budget, which is smaller than probably anybody would expect.
Thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. And please feel free to fill out the survey. You'll get an email with the certificate, and it'll be individualized for this program today. We did record the session, so we'll have that available online as well. Thank you again, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.